everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Anxiety Chats. Today, we are joined by the really lovely Brooke, who has personal experience of OCD and eating disorders, and she talks very openly about the stigmas of mental health online, particularly OCD. So welcome, Brooke. So nice to have you here.
Thank you. I'm super excited to be here, Emily.
Yeah, you've got a really interesting story, Brooke, and I would just love to hear more about it. How would you, if you were describing your story, where would you start? What would you tell us about your mental health story?
So I started showing symptoms of obsessive compulsive disorder when I was around the age of 8. In the very beginning, they displayed a lot as like perfectionism, which was actually a compulsion for a fear that I had of family member dying, specifically my mom or my dad. I started in high school. The perfectionism got really bad, but as you can imagine, OCD back then just wasn't very well known. It wasn't talked about very much. And so I was rewarded for my behaviors, which is not what you want to do. Obviously for compulsions, you don't want to reinforce those behaviors and have them, continue. But by teachers, I was recognized as a perfect student, and my parents thought I was a perfect child. And, at the age of 16, I had 2 jobs, and or 3 throughout high school, and all my employers thought I was great too. But a lot of that came from just those compulsions of perfectionism. I moved into college, lived on campus, and that's kind of when a couple things went awry. So I had 2 situations happen in a really close period of time. I was in a nursing class, and I received a phone call several times from my mom. And so I decided to step out of class to take the call. And on the phone, found out that my grandpa, who was sick with cancer, likely wasn't going to make it to the end of the day. And so she was giving me the opportunity to talk to him on the phone. And I'm very grateful for that opportunity. I was able to talk to him and tell him I loved him. But then in a short time frame after that, my dad got into an accident, and I was in another nursing class and received a bunch of phone calls from my husband now. And so I stepped out of class. I took the call, and he pretty much told me that my dad was in an accident at a construction site and was in an ambulance on the way to the hospital. So thankfully, my dad was okay. It was just a pretty bad, crushed hand injury. He had surgery. He's done well since then, but my OCD really latched onto that, and I developed a pretty significant fear of the phone. And so I stopped answering telephone calls because I had this association that if I answered the telephone, it was going to be bad news. Somebody I knew either was going to be hurt or was going to die. Another thing that happened in college is I started having angry outbursts, which is really not baseline for my personality. And so that was notable. And I just had a lot of stress and anxiety. So I was like, okay, I'm at the point where I think I need help. And so I went to my first therapist, which was on campus, and that was not a good experience. I did not return for another session and decided that I didn't want to do therapy anymore, and it wasn't for me. About a year after that, as you can imagine, the OCD just kept festering and it kept growing, as well as the anxiety with it. So I decided to try again, and I did find a therapist. The subtypes of OCD can switch, and they can adapt, and they can change. So you can maybe feel like you conquer one subtype and then a new subtype pops up. And it really feeds on kind of what's in your environment. So for me, I have a brand new newborn. I started watching him as he was breathing, when he was sleeping. And I know that can be a normal behavior for new parents. But it became very excessive. I spent a lot of time doing that. My OCD really started to get pretty bad during that time frame. And near the end of 2012 into the beginning of 2013, I was like, okay, it's time. I really, really need help. So I made phone calls to all 3. I was able to get in with one. His name is Damon, and I still am with him today. I remember walking into his office for the first time, and he laid out, what a diagnosis of obsessive compulsive disorder looks like. He explained to me exposure response prevention and what that was going to look like for me. We talked about a hierarchy and started developing it. And I was like, wow, okay, we're really on the right track here. Heavily focused and worked on a lot of what I call physical compulsions or tactile compulsions. So at that point in time, I was struggling a lot with contamination in regards to toxic things. I developed orthorexia and was really starting to push that on my family. So a lot of those things are the things we worked on and I did exposures for, and those things got better. So at the end of the 6 months, I kind of was like, yeah, I'm feeling great. Cool. I did okay for a little bit, felt better. And then In 2016, I developed a new subtype that is considered a taboo subtype. It was relationship OCD. And at that point in time, I've been happily married to my high school sweetheart. And I started having intrusive thoughts and images of wanting to be in both physical and emotional relationships with other people. I obviously did not want to share this information with anybody, including my therapist. So I kept it inside. And as you can imagine, the compulsions got worse and worse and worse. And the majority of those compulsions were mental compulsions. So lots of, self-reassurance or seeking reassurance, lots of avoidance, lots of ruminating in my head over whether these thoughts and feelings were real or they weren't. So I ended up having my first full-blown panic attack while I was at work as a surgical nurse. I ended up having a code called on me and had a lot of my colleagues respond to that code. Got worked up for cardiac issues, and then it kind of came to terms that it was a panic attack. So at that point, I was like, okay, I really need to get back in, to treatment and therapy. Called up my therapist, said something's going on. I need to get back in. And so I did. And as you can imagine, in the beginning, it was really challenging for me to talk about that new subtype that had come up, especially with him. So I did not disclose that part for a while. I did disclose the part of having those thoughts and images about my colleagues and my friend. And so he said, we have to start to work on that the same way we did with all of the other obsessions that I was having and compulsions I was dealing with. And I quickly developed at that point in time, they call it thought action fusion, which is when I felt that the thoughts I was having were real and attributed that to me as a person. So because I was having these thoughts, I assumed I was a cheater. So even though I never cheated on my husband, obviously, anytime, I would go to work and see those people, or anytime I would go into my therapist's office and have a treatment session, I felt like a cheater just for being in the presence of those people that I was having those intrusive thoughts about. I started self-punishing myself, and I very quickly pretty much stopped intake of food and started exercising excessively. I lost about 30 pounds in less than 8 weeks and started having cardiac problems. My electrolytes were dangerously low. And so I got really sick, and the people around me were noticing this, and I wasn't, and obviously didn't want to, because at that point in time, I just wanted to continue to punish myself, because that was my compulsion, right? Was to punish myself for those thoughts to help neutralize them. And so one night I remember I was laying in bed with my husband, and he turned to me and he said, I think you're going to die from this. And that was like a huge rude awakening and red flag. And so that next day I went into my therapist's office and I looked at him and I said, I can't stop. I can't help myself. I think this is going south, and I think it's going to get really bad really fast, and I need your help. And so I got admitted to a partial hospitalization program for about 2 months. I told my husband about the thoughts I was having. I told my best friend about the thoughts or my very good friend at that time, about the thoughts I was having. And I ended up finally telling my therapist about the thoughts that I was having. And the reaction from all three was not good. And these are people that very much cared for me at that point in time. But as you can imagine, not being familiar with OCD, that can be a really hard message to hear, right? Like, I'm telling my husband I'm having thoughts of wanting to be with other people, and he's like, what? And I'm explaining to him, and he's so amazing. He has learned so much about this since this has all happened. So he's the first person to be like, it's just a thought. It's just a thought. It doesn't define you. It's just a thought. So I love him, and I love his support, and I'm so thankful for it. But I also had, similar feedback from my friend at the time, kind of like, whoa, what's going on? Had to explain it to him. He seemed very understanding. Unfortunately, that relationship did not make it through my treatment of obsessive compulsive disorder, which is challenging, but I understand, kind of the why. And it's another casualty of my, illness or disorder. And then telling my therapist first reaction, he's very, very good about ethics, and I am so appreciative of that. So his first reaction was, oh my gosh, if you have feelings for me, then, I'm not going to be able to treat you. We're going to have to find somebody else. And I'm like sitting there like, whoa, no, I can't start this journey over with anybody else. So either we're doing this or I'm not doing this at all. kind of a thing. And he was able to better process and, utilize his own resources and colleagues to work through the fact. And, throughout the years, we continue to do check-ins where we're like, okay, are we actually having feelings for each other? No. Okay, we can continue the work that we're doing. Because as you can imagine, some of those exposures are really challenging. When you're doing exposures where you're, asking or telling yourself, oh, I want to be in a relationship with my therapist. Yep, maybe I do. Oh, I want to get married to my therapist. Yep, maybe I do. And then doing those exposures while in his office, sitting across the room from him, that can definitely create kind of that gray space in regards to ethics and whatnot. So it was really important for us to, just continue to define what we were doing. But yeah, so just like I said, I like to share that portion of my journey because I think that's really important because that can happen, right? When you tell people, it's very misunderstood. It takes a lot of time and energy and resources and knowledge to for people to really get a better understanding of what obsessive compulsive disorder is. 2022, I ended up having a manic episode, which I never had a diagnosis of bipolar prior to that. I started, what we think happened is I was working on these really challenging exposures specifically about my therapist and the relationship OCD. And I think it got to be too much. They were too stressful and too anxiety provoking. For the past year, I was on a mood stabilizer that did wonders for me. And actually just very recently in the past several weeks, I was able to titrate off that medication and I seem to be doing okay. I developed panic disorder. So I ended up having another full-blown panic attack. And for some reason, something was triggered. And I started having about 5 to 7 panic attacks a week on a severity of 0 to 10, like a 9. And then titrated off that and started doing interoceptive exposures, which for those of you that aren't familiar, these are exposures specifically related to people that experience panic attacks. And what it is each exposure is inducing that feeling that you get from a panic attack. I feel like I'm at a point now where I've finally allowed myself some grace with this journey and really am able to recognize that I've put in a lot of hard work to where I am now. And I'm super thankful for that.
It's interesting that it's kind of like what you were saying about sub categories of OCD. It's like, it's quite easy actually in some ways to be like, cured from OCD because I'm just not thinking about that now. But it's really difficult. But the real magical work happens when you actually are like, no, I'm going to face it. I'm going to face the facts that these things could happen, or I'm going to face these panic attack symptoms. I'm going to actually experience them and realize with time and support and all of these things, actually, I can get through all of these thoughts and I can get through all of these feelings. That's my biggest question, I think, to you is it feels like you're going against your body's wishes. Everyone says trust your instincts, but I think when you have OCD or severe anxiety, you shouldn't actually always trust your instincts, which is hard because that's what we're told from such a young age is trust your instincts. But you're going against your body, aren't you? Almost like when you're in recovery, when you're doing exposures, your body will be saying one thing, but you know deep down, I actually can't listen to that. And so how do you go against that? Is it just with extreme bravery?
I think the biggest thing that I kind of have taken away from this and I like to share with other people is that if it feels wrong, it's right when it comes to treatment. Because for the longest time, your brain has been programmed to protect yourself from these intrusive thoughts or fearful, images or thoughts by doing these different compulsions. And so when you resist that urge to do that compulsion, that fear is going to build. It's going to get bigger. So it's going to be challenging before it gets easier, for sure. But you sit with that discomfort. I frequently use the phrase of maybe, maybe not, to get myself through those times, really creating that gray and that doubt. I've recognized that my OCD, along with a lot of other people's, is very black and white. It likes very specific answers and responses to everything. And so creating just that area of gray and doubt and not giving in to those compulsions. And don't get me wrong, I have had my challenges with exposure response prevention. There are times when it is really, really, really hard. And my number one go-to was avoidance, for sure. I remember showing up in my therapist's office a week later and he'd be like, okay, so let's see what you did for homework. And I'd be like looking around the room like, do, 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 do. And he'd be like, you didn't do anything, did you? And I'm like, nope. And so like that was a big tactic of mine, was avoidance. And so we really had to work on some of those exposures to find kind of, so I use a scale of 0 to 7 for anxiety, 0 being no anxiety and 7 being high. And so in those times, if that exposure that I was sent home with was a 5 and I didn't do it and I was avoiding it, then when I got back to his office, we would work to rework that exposure to bring it down more to like the 2 or 3 range. But then there were some times, depending on the thought or whatnot, there were sometimes that I was able to kind of tackle it head on, and I preferred exposures that were in that 5-ish range because I just wanted to, hit it head on and get it done. But there were certain categories or types of my OCD that I wasn't as able to do that.
That makes total sense. And something as well you talk a lot about on Instagram, which I really like, which is a huge thing, is a lot of misconceptions about OCD. What are some of the misconceptions that you've come across?
Honestly, I think it comes down to obviously just having the lack of education and knowledge around what obsessive compulsive disorder is. Does everyone with obsessive compulsive disorder, are they clean, neat, and orderly? Absolutely not. There are so many different subtypes. I mean, some of just the ones off the top of my head are harm OCD. We mentioned relationship OCD. There's the perfectionism component. There's pure OCD, which is where you struggle with a lot of just those mental compulsions. I mean, I've probably hit the head on probably 9 subtypes of OCD throughout my journey, if not more. And that can be very common. Like I mentioned before, you start to work on exposure response prevention for one kind of subtype, and you start to kind of conquer that. And sometimes your OCD will be like, ooh, well, I'm just going to latch onto this new thing then, because that doesn't bother you as much anymore. I was always progressing, but progressing in my recovery journey was very slow. And in the past about year to 2 years, I've gained a lot of traction and made a lot of progress and have had a lot of like very consistent outcomes instead of so much of the kind of the ebb and flow and the relapses. And that's not going to be everyone's journey. I think, and I'm a strong believer in this, that the sooner you can get, a qualified treatment provider to provide you with exposure response prevention, the shorter that recovery journey is going to be.
My last question to you is actually, if somebody is listening to this and they're feeling like this resonates with them a lot, they think they have OCD, or their lives are being ruled by OCD, what is the first step? What can they do?
So yeah, I would say first and foremost is resources. The IOCDF has a ton of online resources for people to access. There's documents on their website, readings on their website, blogs on their website. So you can look at both personal lived experience as well as what the research shows, kind of get an idea of what obsessive compulsive disorder is, what some of these subtypes may look like. But I think that the IOCDF is a great starting point. They also have a resource that allows opportunity for you to try to find a provider in your area that is trained in how to treat patients with OCD, as well as trained in exposure response prevention. So I think that is also a good starting point. So I think that's another good resource. And then number one would be advocate for yourself. When you are looking for a provider, you have the ability to interview your provider just as much as you may feel like they're interviewing you. You need to make sure that it's a right fit, not only, just that personal connection, but also to make sure that they are trained to be able to treat you. So I would 100% recommend just asking, are you familiar with exposure response prevention? Do you use this in your practice? I want to use my story and my voice to, raise awareness around OCD, decrease stigmas, give a face to what it may look like, but also increase access to resources and really make sure people I don't want people to have to live the same journey that I did, in the sense of not getting help until I was well into my mid and upper 20s. And at the age of 37, I'm still working on this today.
Thank you so much, Brooke, for sharing all of that, for sharing your story, and for sharing all of that really good information. Anyone listening that also feels like they can relate to Brooke, we will have links to her Instagram where you can go and chat to her. You can see all the amazing things she's talking about over there. And yeah, thank you so much, Brooke, for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
It's been really lovely. And thank you, everybody, for listening to today's episode. And we will see you very soon with a brand new one. Goodbye, everybody.